In this lecture, I'm just going to talk about the importance of schooling investments for females, and I'll go through a stylized theoretical model, and I'll then go through two journal articles that have looked at various reasons for why we observe gender differences in education in India. One is an article that I've written myself, and in another article, I'll just look at a way in which an increase in job opportunities for women can lead to changes in perceptions and late marriage and an increase in schooling enrollments. Okay, so to start with, we know that gender inequality is widely observed in education in many, many different countries. And gender inequality in education has negative effects. Inequality adversely related to economic growth. So in notes, they say that gender inequality reduces the average amount of human capital in a society, in the sense that if 50% of the population, that is females, are not participating in the labor force, then that will mean that the economic development will be hampered. So the second one is that having a better educated mother has good implications on child health. For example, a simple thing like an educated mother is better able to read the instructions on medications, is better able to look after their children when they're sick, and they also want to have better educated children. And then also we see that it has implications for demographic outcomes. For example, if women are spending a longer time in education, this will increase the age at marriage, which means down the track you will see that they will have fewer children, and the few children that they would have aspirations to educate their children. So female education will improve child health and schooling, and also a better educated woman also will look after her own health. And so we'll see that the children that are born are also healthy. And so it has implications beyond just as a good for private consumption. So the third one is what they point out is that female education also improves international competitiveness by increasing the pool of workers. So what do we mean by this? So if you look at the countries in East Asia, for example, that grew very fast, Japan, and then more recently China, and Malaysia and Thailand, many of those countries grew on the back of manufactured goods, export-led industries, and in many of these manufacturing industries, they had large proportions of women that were participating. So having an educated workforce meant that when job opportunities came up in the manufacturing sector, we saw that women were able to be employed in this sector, and it improved the competitiveness of these countries. And of course, the last one is that gender gaps in education will mean that ultimately there's also gender gaps in employment. This means that if there are fewer women getting educated, then there will be fewer women entering the labor market, which means that the gaps between male and female education will widen. Okay, so beyond that, educating girls is important for a variety of reasons. The first one is that we need to reduce gender gaps in schooling, which was one of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. And subsequently, we have seen that the United Nations has introduced the Sustainable Development Goals, according to which Goal 4 says that we need to provide quality education, and goal 5 says there should be gender equality in education. So both of these are directly related to improve gender equality in access to education by 2030. And then just going through some of the journal articles, gender equality will lower mortality, which is child mortality, and will also reduce fertility rates. Gender inequality in education will contribute to slower economic growth, particularly in developing countries. These are some of the studies that have looked at it. And of course, it enhances the quality of life and promotes fundamental human freedoms and is a worthy objective in its own rights. And finally, gender equality also will improve female wages and increase the incentives for women to participate in the labor market. Despite this, what we see is across many countries in the world, we see that there is underinvestment in girls' education. So even though we see that from an economic perspective, we would like to see more girls participating in the labor market, in reality, we see that there is an underinvestment in girls' education. And remember that investment in girls' education happens in the household. So decisions on whether to invest in girls' education will depend on many different factors. For example, it could be in areas where the economic development is very low, opportunities to get employment is very low, there are no job opportunities. So the perception is that maybe just invest in the education of the boys. So that's one reason where we see more investment in boys' education rather than girls. The other one is for resource constraints. If the parents have resource constraints, if they are very poor, then education in girls. So for instance, they have to make a decision on which child they should invest in. And if they're very resource constrained, they would prefer to invest in the child from whom they get higher returns. So for instance, traditionally in Indian society and in many societies around the world, it's the boy child who grows up and looks after the parents when they are elderly. And so there's a greater incentive for parents to invest in the education of the child who's going to look after them in their old age. So resource constraints will mean that often parents have to make a choice on which child would get the education, and they then end up with having to choose educating the boy child. Then the other reason or economic factor that leads to less education for girls is if there is child labor, and then it may be that girls may not be formally working in the, but they might be contributing in the house, looking after their younger siblings while the mother is going to work, or they might work in the informal sector, or they might work in as maids and so on. So in environments where child labor is prevalent, the education of children may not be as valued, because again, there might be less opportunities for them to get a job, or the schooling system itself may not be regarded as being desirable. Then finally, from the parents' perspective, if they see that the returns from educating male children is greater, then we see that in these environments, boys will end up getting more education than girls. Okay, what are some of the social factors? Because we know that it's not just economic factors that influence household decisions on investing in children's education. It could also be social factors. So anthropologists and sociologists have pointed to the role of kinship norms. And an important kinship norm that has been observed in many countries, and particularly in India and in northern India in particular, is what is known as what they call the patrilocal exogamy. This is what they mean. This is the idea that the girl will marry and move to a different household and in a different village, typically in a different district. And in the south, what happens is the kinship norms are slightly different. Marriage between cousins is acceptable, and marriages can sometimes, quite often, happen in the same village. So what this means is in the south, I'm just saying this generally, this is a kinship norm that you may find in some southern states like Tamil Nadu and so on. What you'll find is that the daughter would marry and live in the same village. So she lives close by, so she can come and visit her parents frequently. She can help the parents. So there's much more connection with the parents after marriage. But if you have a kinship norm known as what they call patrilocal exogamy, where the daughter marries outside the district or in a different village, it means that they don't have the frequent contact with their parents, and they become, like almost marrying out. So then it means that there's less incentive to educate these girls, because the benefits from educating them goes to the in-laws family rather than the parents getting any benefit. The other social norm is dowry. So even though officially dowry is banned, it is still the case that it's the female's parents who bear the bulk of the marriage expenses. So when a daughter is born, it's almost like the dowry is a form of inheritance that's given to the daughter, whereas the son gets the land or the house or property. So that's another social norm. So the daughter gets the dowry, and so that's money that is going to another family. So again, because they have to, they expect that they're going to spend more on the daughter's wedding and dowry expenses, and then the daughter is going to marry and move to another family, there's less incentive to educate the daughter. So this is coming from the sociological literature. And then also son preference. So this comes out of, again, the idea that the son is going to look after the parents. So, and the parents in their old age will live with the son and their family. So less incentive to educate the daughter compared to the son. Okay. And then some people talk about gender stereotyping and less attention given to girls, in the sense that there is an expectation that girls are going to get married and move out. So no point in educating them. So I might just go through a very simple stylized model of education choice. Because education decisions are made at the household level, and we think of education as an investment made by parents, let's just go through a very simple model. So assume that parents make schooling decisions for their children, and parents' utility is a function of the schooling that their child gets. So we assume that the parents care about educating their children. They do care. And they also care about the income that the child will earn when they grow up. Okay, so parents' utility function, this is U, is a function of the income that the child will earn when they grow up and the level of education that the child gets. We assume that it's in years. And that is going to be equal to some share of the child's earnings that the parents might be able to get, minus the cost of educating the child. Okay? So then we assume that earnings are a function of schooling, which means that the more schooling or education that you get, the higher your earnings are going to be. So the log of earnings, which is log of the earnings that you get, the child's earnings when they grow up and start earning income, is going to be equal to A which is a fixed term, plus B times S. So B is simply the extent to which your future earnings will rise. So B just says that for each additional year of education that you get, future earnings will rise by B%. Okay, so of course, we know that if you study up to year 10, at 10 standard, and then you study one more year, it doesn't mean that your earnings will rise going from 10 standard to 11 standard, right? So I'm just giving you this stylized model. We can't say that the linearity assumption is correct. What I'm trying to say here is, say that you assume that a child graduates from high school, then they get a certain amount of income. Then if they finish another 3 years of, say, bachelor's degree, that's another threshold. So it's not actually year by year, but rather a qualification that they get, okay? So if you get, say, a bachelor's education, your earnings will rise by a certain amount. If you get a master's, it rises by a certain amount. Okay, so B simply says the percentage increase of future earnings that you get if you invest in additional years of schooling or education. Okay, and remember that when we are talking about education, I'm saying this in a very generic way. It also depends on which education you get, right? So there might be higher returns maybe to get a medical education or a commerce education than there might be if you maybe get some music or some other education. Okay, so there is a difference also in the quality or type of education, and of course it will depend on the skills market. At this point, I'm just looking at a household making a decision on how much to invest in their children's education. Okay, so this is just looking at supply side, at demand side, demand for education and how parents make that decision. Okay, so the earnings will depend on the amount of schooling that the child gets. But schoolings, of course, have a cost. There is a cost to education. So what are these costs? Okay, so we assume that there is a fixed cost of education and there is a variable cost. So fixed cost could be like a tuition fee or something like that, tuition fee or uniforms or textbooks. So this is fixed, right? So you buy this at the start of the year and that will last you through the year. There's also a variable component, which is alpha. Okay, so what this means is that if you are investing in education, it means that this is time that you're not spending in the workforce. So there is an opportunity cost attached to this. So alpha is simply the variable cost attached to education. And we assume that alpha is typically positive because regardless of what you do, there's always an opportunity cost, right? So if you're, say, studying a PhD, it means that this is time that you're not working. So there is always an opportunity cost. So we assume that alpha is positive. So then we just say you've got a utility function where parents get utility from income and income that the child earns when they grow up. So that's their future earnings, and S is the years of schooling that they get. And so M is the share of the child's earnings that the parents might get in future. This could be, simply the child living with the parents, or the parents might get some remittances from the child, minus the cost of the education. Okay, and then we say that earnings will depend on. This is just the two equations that I just went through. Earnings will depend on the fixed component plus the component that changes depending on the level of education that you get. And then cost of education will also depend on the fixed plus the variable costs. So substituting 2 and 3 into the utility function and solving for the first order conditions, we just get the optimum amount of schooling that will be chosen by the parents. Okay, so I'm just giving you a very stylized model. Of course, there are many other aspects that we need to look at because schooling decisions are being made at the moment, but earnings are in the future. Okay, so all we're saying then is that optimum amount of schooling that the child will get will be equal to MB, share of income that the parents will get, times the increase in income that from each additional year of schooling, minus the fixed cost of schooling divided by alpha, which is the variable costs of schooling. Okay, so we say that alpha is typically greater than 0, and so this is just a very simplistic model, and I'm just trying to say that you will not choose 0 amount of schooling and you can't choose an infinite amount of schooling. Okay, so we basically say that it's a linear model. Okay, so just moving on. So basically what we want to see is what are the factors that motivates or prevents parents from sending their children to school. Okay, so we are really interested in the choice variables, and those choice variables are M, B, R, and alpha. Okay, so M is the share that the parents get. And so let's see, what determines the direct cost of school education, which is alpha? So direct costs are simply costs such as, the cost of the uniforms, the tuition fee, the cost of the transport to get to the schools, and so on. And indirect costs are simply the opportunity cost. So it may be that in the context of girls, it may be that spending more time in education may mean that they're not getting married or they're not working, right? So there's an opportunity cost. So again, how do these costs differ across boys versus girls? The direct costs we would think should not differ, right, for boys versus girls. But sometimes if the school is a long way away, for example, then the parents may be reluctant to send their girls to a school that's a long distance away for safety reasons, or maybe it's not very safe, or it's not a good school. There might not be toilets in the school, and so on. So these may be different for boys and girls. Again, rural versus urban may be different because it may be that urban areas have better quality infrastructure, better quality schools, better job opportunities, so parents may feel more inclined to send their children to school, right? So it's a cost in the sense that the cost of accessing schools is borne by the parents, right? So for instance, in urban areas, schools may be more easily available, closer. In rural areas, they may not be that close. So there is a cost attached to it. And then, of course, if you have a large family, there might be some sharing of textbooks and uniforms and so on between brothers and sisters. But again, it might be that the costs are higher for a larger family in terms of the resource costs, right, of sending more of their children to school. So what about returns to education? So returns to education simply means for each year of education that you invest in, what is the return that you get in terms of higher job earnings? Now, that will, of course, depend not just on your education that you invest in, but also on the types of jobs that are in demand. That will depend on the pool of workers in that market. It will depend on in demand from the industries and so on. So it depends on factors that are outside the control of the household. Again, it might differ by boys and girls. Like some firms some types of employment may have higher returns for boys relative to girls. So if parents think, for example, that there's a lower chance that their daughter will get a job in this industry, they may not prefer to educate their daughter in that industry. Okay, so there might be some gender differences depending on the type of employment. There might be differences depending on rural versus urban. And of course, there's differences between rich versus poor households in the ability to access different types of jobs. And so because of this, the investment that parents make in their children's education will also differ, because they are making this investment depending on what they perceive to be the returns from the labor market in the future. Again, it depends also on the quality of education. So, for example, in remote rural areas, the quality of the schools might be very poor, the infrastructure may not be very good, teacher absenteeism may be quite high. So, under those circumstances, parents may feel, what's the point educating the daughter when they could, maybe they just need to learn to cook or, something like that. So there might just be less incentive to educate daughters if the parents know that the quality of education is not that good. That might also hold for boys as well, not just for girls. Also, I should say that when we talk about S in this model, S is, we say it's years of schooling, but it's not the same as education. Okay, so this is the example I was telling you before. You could say, I've got 6 years of education or 10 years of education. It's not the same thing as having a degree qualification or saying, I finished my 12th standard, or I finished my bachelor's degree, or I finished my master's degree. So that's an education, completing a degree, and years of schooling is different. Okay. Finally, what determines parents' share of M that they get? So why do parents value children's earnings? We say that in societies where there's no old age security payments, no formalized form for elderly people to access payments from the government, then children are a means for them to, for their old age security. So, and typically where the social norms are that the son looks after the parents, we see that parents may care more about the education of their sons rather than their daughters. Again, it comes down to the point that daughters will marry and move out. And it may be that the sons move out as well. It's not that they don't, but oftentimes parents seem reluctant to get financial support from their daughters compared to from their sons. So these gender norms do mean that the investment in daughters' education will be lower than the investment in sons' education. Okay. What are some of the other potential factors? There could be other factors such as, for example, credit constraints. So credit constraints are simply this idea that, if the parents have to take a big loan to invest in their children's education, and because there's opportunity cost attached to it, they may not be willing to do that if it is, if the returns that they're going to get from the education is very low. Okay, so there are credit constraints, and if they're poor and they need to mortgage their land or their property, they may not do that if they have to for the daughter's education, but they might do it for the son's education if they feel that the son, once he gets educated, will pay back the mortgage and look after them. Okay, so credit constraints are a big factor. And also then there are externalities. transport costs, social capital. So having more educated people in the community is good. So good for everyone to live in a more educated community. And empowerment, having more education means that if it is for women, they feel more empowered, they feel more likely to be able to make decisions, they're much more likely to be involved in decision making, politics, and much more likely to participate in paid employment. And information is simply the idea that a better educated person is in a better position to access information, and which means that they are able to, if there's corruption, say, for example, in society, then if you had a more educated population, they're more likely to hold the leaders to account. Okay, so there are positive externalities from education. Negative externalities are simply the idea that when many people in society get educated, then it becomes difficult to distinguish between the educational achievements of different people. So what you have then is a situation where people invest more and more in education. So, and then the competition for jobs becomes quite high, and then you have a limited number of jobs available, but there's a large pool of people looking for those jobs. So that means that you have a high level of youth unemployment, educated unemployment, and so on. Okay, so it's just a small negative externality, but in general, education has huge positive externalities and benefits. I might just, I was going to go through a journal article of mine actually. It's called Gender Inequality and Education and Kinship Norms in India. And so what we have done in this paper is we use the nationally representative district level data from India to investigate the links between gender inequality in education and kinship norms and economic development. So we wanted to see what were the factors that influenced decisions to invest in women's education. So the background is basically that I go back to that sociological norm, right? The patrilocal exogamy norm. So according to those types of norms, there is which relate to marriage, property ownership, and inheritance. And so what they basically argue, the sociological literature has argued that the decision to invest in sons' education is made because typically sons look after the parents, daughters marry out, sons inherit the property, and traditionally daughters get dowry instead of inheritance. So that's the idea that the sociological literature has put forth for explaining why there's gender inequality in education in India. Okay, and then a study by Dyson and Moore in 1983. It's an old study, but what they did, they looked at norms in different parts of India, and they found that, for example, in the south and a little bit in the west, there was greater inequality of not west, I should say east, right? Bengal and all that. There was greater equality between male and female education compared to the north. So they attributed this to marriage norms and norms on inheritance. So what we've tried to do in this paper is that we've looked at the sociological norms, and we also tried to examine the economic reasons for why there are gender gaps in education. So in economics literature, there are two main reasons for why we observe gender gaps in education. The first one is labor market discrimination, which argues that if the employers value female education less than that of male, education, then economic incentives to educate girls are lower. So that's one reason. And the other one is returns to education, the fact that, again, that's tied to the sociological literature, but the fact that the daughter leaves the house after marriage, which means any returns to investment in daughter's education will go to the in-laws household. Okay, so the data that we use in this study comes from the district level household survey. So this was from 2007 and 2008. So, and we combined that with this survey we had in 2011 called the Indicus Analytics. We just took the GDP per capita in every district from this survey. And the district level household survey is a survey of about 5,889,783 households across 585 districts in India. So they've left out the smaller districts. So from this, we use this data to look at district level trends. And the second data we look at is the Indian Human Development Survey, 2011 and 2012. We do this to look at household level data. The good thing about this survey is that they have a direct question on the norms, the social norms, and they ask the question in the household. So we know then that these are the norms in this community. So given these norms, what are the gender gaps? So the research questions that we want to answer is, do social norms influence the gender gaps in education? And are gender gaps lower in richer districts? Okay, so if more jobs are available, are they more likely to educate the girls? And then, is there any association between female labor force participation and gender equality in education? Okay, again, this comes back to the point that we see that in India, the female labor force participation in paid employment is actually quite low and declining over time. And this is because more educated women, I think, are dropping out of the labor force. And they have been, and whereas what we see among women in, say, in the farms or in rural areas, in informal labor force, we see a greater participation at the lower end of the scale. So, and whereas middle class women are dropping out. So what we want to see is whether better educated, whether there's any association between gender gaps in education and female labor force participation. So just looking at the data here, this is, remember, of course, 2008, a little bit old, but I'm using, that was the latest data at the time when we wrote the paper. And so you can see here, just looking at panel A and panel B, you see that states where GDP per capita is quite low, they have bigger gender gaps in education. Of course, this has changed over time. We know that in Bihar in particular, girls' education has gone up after the government intervention through the cycle program. But in this, at this time, we see clearly states where GDP per capita is high, gender gap in education is low. And these are also, you know, for example, see Kerala, look at Goa, and then you look at Bihar, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Assam, Orissa, and Rajasthan, right? So we do see that there is a negative correlation. Now this is from the IHDS survey. So they actually had a direct question. They asked every household, in your community, is it common for the daughter to marry within the village? And what is interesting is even in communities where daughters marry within the village, it's negatively correlated with whether parents feel that they can be, whether they consider being financially supported by their daughter in old age. So what we found in this survey is that even in areas where the daughter lives in the same village, they don't want to rely on their daughters for financial support. Only about 24% said that they are comfortable being supported by their daughter in the old age. But what we see though is that if the daughter is marrying and living in the same village, the female years of schooling are positive and statistically significant. This is just raw data. This is just looking at correlation. What we're seeing is if the daughter marries in the same village, then female years of schooling are higher, okay, and positive. And we also see that female years of schooling are positive if they consider, if they are happy to be supported by their daughter in the old age. Also, you see female years of schooling are positive. Okay, so this is simply a correlation, not a regression results, but what we see is a negative correlation between, a positive in both cases between female education in terms of years of schooling, and A, the daughter lives in the same village, and B, they consider being supported by your daughter in the old age. Okay, these are social norms. So this is showing that the social norms where the daughter lives in the village, and the social norm where typically the son looks after the parents, but if the parents feel it's okay to accept financial support from the daughter, they are more likely to educate their daughters in that case. Okay, but typically we find that they are less likely to be comfortable receiving financial support from their daughter in the old age, even in areas where they are, daughter lives close by. So what is Iconometric Strategy? We just ran OLS regressions for two dependent variables. So the unit of analysis here, this is the district level household survey. We looked at the unit of analysis is the district. So what we did was for each district, this variable gender gap, which is our dependent variable, is simply the difference between male education in that district, male years of schooling minus female years of schooling in the district. Okay, so it's simply a difference in, so we have calculated a gender gap for each district. Okay, and female education is simply the proportion of girls in that district who are educated. Okay, so the unit of analysis is that is the district. And what is interesting is that in all the states in India, there is a pro-male bias, which means that the only exception is Kerala, where there's equal education, but other than Kerala, in every Indian state, the preference, there are more males rather than females educated. But this is just looking at district averages. And then what we did, we just estimated a regression, two separate regressions, OLS. So the dependent variable is gender gap in education, percentage. Okay, what's the proportion of gender gap by district? Okay, so this is district level results using the DLHS data. So what is interesting here is that here we see that clearly there's a negative correlation between gender gap in education and GDP per capita of the districts. Okay, so basically what it's saying is that when you have higher GDP per capita in the state, GSP per capita, which is the state's income per capita, then gender gaps are lower. Okay, so higher GDP in the state is associated, in the district rather, sorry, in the district is associated with lower gender gap in education. And interestingly, we see a positive correlation between women's. So I'll just quickly go through this women ever schooled. Again, district averages. We see that high proportion of women are schooled when per capita income of that district is higher. And also we see women's work participation is lower. Again, this is consistent with this result, that it's negatively correlated with being schooled. And I think this is because we see a lot of less educated women in the informal sector. So let me go to the IHDS results. This is at the household level. So here we actually have a direct question on whether the family lives close enough to visit and return on the same day. So here we see that, again, that the gender gap in education, in years of education, is lower if if you live close to your parents' family. And this is the patrilocal exogamy norm. And relative to the north, we find that we just put the states together because otherwise it would have been a very long table. We see relative to the north, every east, west, and in the south, we see that gender gap in education is lower. Turning to years of schooling, again, we see that we see the same trends. We see that this norm, social norm, is associated with higher number of years of schooling. Okay, so just summing up, we found strong evidence that this norm on patrilocal exogamy, where wives migrate to co-reside with their husband's family, is associated with negative educational outcomes for women. Okay, it doesn't mean that it's for all women. Obviously, we see high levels of education in many states where these norms are practiced, but it's just those constraints. These norms might play a role. Okay, and we find that this finding is consistent across different data sets and definitions of patrilocal exogamy, and it accords with anthropological research and empirical studies on social norms. And interestingly, we find that greater female labor force participation is associated with lower education outcomes for women. Okay, so I'll move on to another paper, and this is by Robert Jensen. And what he looked at in this paper is he was interested in looking at whether availability of job opportunities will affect young women's work and family decisions. Okay, so this is a slightly different type of paper. It's not directly looking at women's education, but rather looking at whether if employment opportunities come up for qualified women, would that mean that we would see across that community a likelihood that women would want to work, and whether the younger girls may have more education. Okay, the motivation for this paper is that in many countries, like even in India, women marry very young and they start having children at quite a young age. So, for example, between 2005 and 2006, in rural India, the median age for marriage was about 17, and the median age of first birth was about 19. And women have on average at that time 4.3 births over their lifetime, and workforce participation in the formal sector was about 20%. Okay, so although we see women participating participation is very low in paid employment, of course, women work in the household production sector, they work in family enterprises in the informal sector and in agriculture. So what they did with this paper is they looked at an experimental design where they looked at the BPO sector. So the BPO industry, the business process outsourcing industry, is like call centers, right? So this is considered to be like a well-paid white-collar job. And sometimes the BPO jobs are available, but people may not have information about it or an ability to access them. So what they tried to do in this paper is they conducted a randomized trial where they went in there using recruiters for a business process outsourcing industry. So what they did, the sector at that time was not well known in rural areas. And so what they did was they worked with some recruitment firms to randomly select rural villages and provide services, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. Basically to provide information about BPO sector, about the job opportunities here, and they targeted women, only women, because they wanted to see the impact on female labor force participation. So they targeted women and they provided this information only to women on availability of jobs. They trained the women for the jobs and they provided women with interview skills and they provided this service for about 3 years. So the reason for this is the BPO sector typically has hired predominantly women and it's considered to be a safe white collar job. And what they say is that this is a sector where there's very low social stigma attached. So women may not like working outside the home. So BPO may be an opportunity for women to work outside the home in a sector that has high human capital relatively, and it's a white collar job. So the methodology was that basically they asked these recruiters to create a list of rural districts which were hard to reach, where they hadn't gone, the recruitment people hadn't gone to these rural districts, and they chose villages that were about 50 to 100 kilometers around Delhi from Haryana, Punjab, UP, and Rajasthan. Okay, so these were all close to Delhi because sometimes these jobs were actually available in Delhi. So they wanted these women to be able to move and relocate to Delhi after the experiment. Okay, so they then compiled a list of villages in those districts that were hard to reach. So they had 80 control villages, which were similar in characteristics in every way to these other 80 villages, which were the treatment villages. So what they did was in these villages, in the treatment villages, they randomly assigned 8 recruiters to each of these treatment villages to provide this service. And 3 information sessions were held. And the information sessions included, like advertised through the local leaders, to the NGOs. They were publicly held, information was given out, and the sessions provided information on the types of work in the BPO industry, the compensation in terms of the salary that you could get if you got a job here. And they also provided a list of the firms that were looking for these types of workers, and they mainly targeted women. And they targeted women who had a little bit of computer skills and could speak in English, because those were the 2 requirements in the BPO sector. Okay, and then they provided them with strategies, they helped them with their CVs, and had mock interviews and so on. And then what they conducted a survey And they conducted a survey in all the 160 villages. Okay, the 80 treatment and the 80 control villages, which didn't receive the treatment. And in each village, they went to about 20 households per village, 8 times all these villages. 160 villages times 20 households. In each household, household questionnaire collected information on the socioeconomic and demographic traits of all the household members, and they collected individual questionnaire on the marital status, fertility, the number of children the women had, employment history, their expectations about jobs, and so on. And this was done between September and October 2003, okay? And then they went in with the intervention. They provided women with the assistance. The women that were chosen had secondary school education, had some English, and had some knowledge, right? And the BPO recruiters emphasized that they were not guaranteeing the jobs, so they were just providing the information. So they were just there to say, these are the types of jobs that are available in this industry, and this is what you need to do, and this is the type of interview questions you need to be prepared for, and so on. Okay, so they were not guaranteeing the jobs, they were just providing the information. Okay, and they work through government offices and NGOs and so on to advertise these sessions. And then they had the follow-up survey just to see whether this had any impact, okay? So the follow-up survey tracked the women who left the household for work or marriage, and these were contacted via 4 surveys. They were about 91% in round 1 and 94% in round 2. So the empirical strategy was, there were baseline differences between the 2 groups, which is the control and the treatment. But actually in the baseline, they were very similar. The 2 groups of villages were very similar. And then they estimated linear regressions for multiple specifications. I'll come to that in a minute. And they focused on women aged 15 to 21 years at baseline, which was in 2003. So these were women that were old enough to be placed in a BPO job during the 3-year period when they had this intervention. And these women might choose to forego marriage or children in order to work in this sector. And this was also the peak period when they might decide either to work or to get married. Okay, so they were interested then in the human capital outcomes and whether these women who are trained were able to get a job in the BPO sector in the subsequent survey, round 2, and also they were interested in the human capital outcomes among women and young girls in that village. Okay, so it's basically regressing the outcomes on a treatment village. So basically 18 to 24, so this is at round 2, right? So these were women in column 1, these were women who were 15 to 21, and they were the women that received the treatment. Okay, so treatment, remember, is simply being able to have information about BPOs, be trained in interviews, be trained in strategies, have their CVs, have some improvement in their skills and so on. So what we observe here is that in panel 1, remember the treatment was only for women. Okay, so of course you could assume that information or knowledge might travel to the control villages as well, which did not receive the treatment, right? But if you look at these results, you can see that the effect of the treatment was that women from villages who received the treatment were 4.6 percentage points more likely to be employed in the BPO sector after 3 years. Okay, so they're trying to say that this intervention was very effective. And these women who received the treatment were also 2.4 percentage points more likely to work away from home in any sector. Okay, so not only did we see an improvement in BPO employment, but only for those women who lived in villages that received the treatment, but we also see that there was a significantly higher probability for these women to work outside the house. Okay, and then what we see is, if you compare the control women who lived in the control villages with the treatment villages, we see that for these questions, for example, do you expect to work for pay away from home before you get married? We see that in the treatment villages, 43% women said yes, which means that, remember, I didn't show you the slide, but it's in the paper. At the time before the BPO intervention, at the baseline, both groups of villages had similar characteristics in terms of women's aspirations. What we see now is, after the intervention, we see a significant improvement in the proportion of women in the treatment villages who are willing to work away from home. Okay, it's about 10 to 13 percentage points more. Okay, and we also see here, 10 percentage points here after marriage, but before they have children. Also, we see there's a big difference between these villages. And then we see in 3 of these categories, we see women aged 18 to 24 over their life cycle expressed a desire to be willing to work away from home. So we see that this intervention was highly effective in changing perceptions about women's willingness to work in a sector outside the household. Okay, so then we look at the women in the treatment villages. So these were the women, remember the treatment was only to women aged 15 to 21, right? So in round 2, these women were 18 to 24. So we see that between 2003 to 2006, these women were still enrolled in training. So this meant that with the intervention, relative to the control villages, women in the control villages, we see that women in the treatment villages were 2.8 percentage points more likely to still be enrolled in training, which means they're still getting an education. And what is also interesting is that within that same village which received treatment, there is also an aspiration among children, young girls, that is, to be continuing to be in school. So girls aged 6 to 17 from these treatment villages were also more likely to be in school. Okay, so we see that enrollment, this was like an externality. We see an increase in an improvement in enrollment of girls aged 6 to 17. So these are not girls who received the BPO treatment, but these girls lived in the villages where the BPO treatment was given. So what this is telling us is that this intervention also had an externality for young girls and parents wanting to have their girl children educated. And then they looked at a couple of other aspects. They looked at the BMI of BMI is just body mass index of girls aged 5 to 15, which means they've also significantly more likely to have a higher BMI. So this is simply because there is literature which says that if there is son preference, then we see resources being taken away from the girl child, and it's not just education, but also in terms of food and medications provided more to the boys. So, but what we see here is that one of the girls aged 5 to 15 who are not part of the treatment age group, but happen to be living in these villages, we see that for these girls there was an improvement in their BMI. Okay, again we see no change for boys. Okay, so boys were not affected by this BPO treatment. And then also in round 2, they were interested in looking at asking women their questions on their marriage and fertility decisions. And what is interesting here is that women were 5.1 percentage points less likely to have married after, between the times that the first survey was conducted and in round 2. So these women were aged 18 to 24 and were 5.1 percentage points less likely to be married relative to the women in the control villages. And we also see that nearly 5.7 percentage points less likely to have had a child. Okay, so what all this is telling us is that this BPO intervention, or having this sort of intervention that might improve labor market prospects for girls, also has the effect of having a positive externality on young girls' education and access to resources in terms of food and so on. But also among these women, we see that this BPO intervention, actually all they did was provided information about their potential for being able to get another white-collar job. And what this did was it improved their likelihood to continue being in education relative to the control group. It also improved their likelihood of being in working outside the household. It reduced their likelihood of being married, and they had 0.35 fewer children relative to the control group. And of course, no effect on boys or men. So, summing up, what we see is that all the available data sets show that the gender gap in primary school enrollment is closing. So in primary school, we see gender gap is closing, but the available data sets from India show that expenditure on boys' education still continues to be high relative to girls, and this could be increasing learning outcomes for girls. And it's unclear whether this is related to gender differentials in the labor market returns or its parental bias towards boys. And what we see is that there's heterogeneity across states, by caste, by rural-urban differences. But what we see is social factors still play a role. And this paper by Jensen has shown that some interventions seem to be working in increasing female labor force participation, and this in turn can improve education outcomes for girls.